How to best live in the present, according to the Buddha. Lean into the present. It's a commonplace that you'll find in a lot of books of wise sayings that people spend so much time living in the future that they never really live in the present. And just because it's a commonplace doesn't mean it's not true. The question is, how do you live in the present? How do you best live in the present? It's possible just to be right here, but just being here is not enough. You have to really know right here. That means taking the mind that sometimes leans into the future, sometimes leans into the past, and try to lean into the present moment instead. Remind yourself that if anything of value is going to be found in the meditation, it's going to be found here. Even though the present moment may not be all that good, you can't let that get in the way. In fact, that's a lot of what it means to dig down into the present moment. Getting past the things that are not good, and finding what potentials you have there that really are worthwhile. Think of the breath. Who would have thought that you could find awakening by staying with the breath? But it is possible. The Buddha did it. Many other members of the noble Sangha in the past have done it. And what's the difference between your breath and their breath? It's the same thing. The difference is in the attention they paid to the breath itself and the attention they paid to questions around the breath. So pay attention to the breath. How's it going right now? How could it be changed for the better? When we talk about being in the present moment, it doesn't mean just sitting with whatever. The present moment is full of potentials, and the mind is very good at taking those potentials and turning them into something else. The Buddha talks about the aggregates as all being shaped by fabrication. We fabricate the sense of the body for the sake of having a sense of the body, because we want to do something with a body. We fabricate feelings because we want feelings. The same with perceptions, thought fabrications, consciousness. We do this for the sake of something, but all too often we're not really clear about what the for the sake is. All we know is that we're leaning in that direction. What the Buddha's telling us is to be here with the breath in order to fabricate feelings around the breath. Fabricate your perceptions around the breath for the sake of settling in and really get to know the breath, to see what potentials it's got. This too is something we fabricate. In and out breathing is bodily fabrication, and the perceptions you apply to it are mental fabrication. The way you talk about it is verbal fabrication. You're doing these things all the time with other topics. The Buddha's simply saying to bring them all together right here. If the body's not feeling very good right now, find some spot that you can lay claim to where it's okay. If it were painful everywhere, as Ajahn Lee pointed out, you'd die. It's simply a matter of learning how to recognize where there's something potentially good. It may not be all that outstanding to begin with. It may seem pretty ordinary, but sometimes very ordinary things can have an extraordinary side. Years back, I happened to be in Japan, and on the TV they had a documentary about a living national treasure, an artist. I forget exactly what the art was. It had to do with cutting things out of paper. He'd dawdle little lines here, little lines there, and it didn't look like much. It looked like he was just a little kid fooling around. But then he started cutting, and by the time he was done, he had something that was pretty amazing. That's what artists do. They take very ordinary materials and can make amazing things out of them. Well, this is what meditators should be able to do too. You can take your breath and make something amazing out of it. A place where you can stay in abundant comfort. A place where the mind can settle down and really get to know itself. The vast majority of people go through life without really knowing their own minds. You ask people after they've done something, "Why did you do that?" And they have to stop and think for a bit. All too often, it's simply on impulse, and the impulse gets quickly forgotten. Yet this is how their lives are shaped. So here we have this opportunity to get to see the mind in action by anchoring it in the breath. This is the place to be. Because the impulses happen in the present moment, the intentions happen in the present moment, everything happens in the present moment. It's simply a question of, Are we here in the present moment, or are we leaning someplace else? Let's try to lean back into the present and be satisfied trying to figure this out. Remember, we're here not simply for the sake of ease. The ease helps, but we're here for the sake of seeing how the mind creates suffering out of things it doesn't have to suffer over. There can be pain in the body, but the mind doesn't have to suffer from the pain. There can be crazy thoughts going through the mind, but the mind doesn't have to suffer from them. You can find a part of your awareness that can stand apart. If it gets impatient wanting to solve the problem right now, remember, the present moment is a strange thing. It stretches on and on and on. This is the present, now this is the present, now this is the present. We keep having present moments. So if you don't understand everything right now, well, keep looking right here, right now. Don't go casting off into the past or future. Otherwise, you're like that story they tell in the Philippines of the man who's taking a boat from one island to the next. He dropped something overboard in the middle of the voyage, so he waited until he got to the port and then started looking overboard for what he had dropped. People asked him, "Why are you looking here when you dropped it over there?" He said, "Well, here the light is better. It's easier to see." We keep thinking that someplace else, some other time, we'll be able to see things, and we get impatient for that other time. We don't really see what's going on right now. You want to look at the breath right now, because as you watch the breath, it's not just the breath. You're watching the mind as well. Even though the breath can be very interesting, it can do lots of different things in the body, it's not nearly as interesting as the mind. When you get the hang of how to watch the mind so that you're not fooled by it, that's when the meditation gets really interesting and satisfying. You see how you've been fooling yourself, but you're not fooled anymore. Now, in some cases, that might sound like you've had it with your mind, but that's not the case. You realize there is the part of the mind that can figure things out, and you learn how to side with that. That's the side that gets released. So you want to learn how to side with that side of the mind, the side that's willing to watch and ask questions. Where is the craving right now? Where is the clinging right now? If you're not sure, ask yourself, where is the mind suffering right now? Where is the location of that suffering? There's that passage where the Buddha asks, "The things you've never seen before, do you have any desire there?" You might say, "Well, yes. There are lots of things I haven't seen that I would like to see," but that's not what he's saying. In your particular case, the desire is not at the sight. The desire's at your perception, your thought about the sight. It's the same as when we're attracted to a person. Sometimes we're not so much attracted to the actual person as we are to our perceptions around the person, which is a setup for a lot of suffering. We find that the person, after all, is not the same thing as those perceptions. So, we want to see, where in the mind right now is the craving focused? Where is the suffering located? You've got to stay with the breath to give yourself a good place to stand, to watch, and ask these questions. But be confident that everything you need to know is right here. And if one line of questioning doesn't get to the answer, you might try another one. But just keep at it, keep at it, keep at it. Try to gain some energy from the breath and some confidence from the fact that other people have done this, and they all started out as ordinary human beings. If they can do it, so can you. The more you can take an interest in your own mind and the workings of your mind, the more you'll be on course. Sometimes we sit and meditate and other things come up. Visions can come. Intuitions can come. But you have to ask yourself, are these relevant to the working of my mind right now? How are my perceptions dealing with this? How are my thought fabrications dealing with this? Where is my clinging and craving around this? If the intuitions give you insight into those questions, okay, then they're useful. If they're intuitions of another sort, just put them aside. Because this is where the real work is done. This is the Buddha's real genius, to realize that this is the best use of your powers of concentration, this is the best use of your time. Once you figure out how the mind creates unnecessary suffering for itself, you find that there's a lot more that you're going to discover as well, things of even greater value. So try to lean into the present moment, because that's where the action is. The varieties of fabricated experience. The term fabrication, Saṅkhāra, refers both to intentional actions, mental or physical, as well as to the mental or physical conditions they shape. You can recognize something as fabricated when you can discern three characteristics in its behavior: its arising, its passing away, and its alteration while staying. Anything where the three opposite characteristics can be discerned, no arising, no passing away, and no alteration while staying, counts as unfabricated, AN 347-48. This right here is one of the Buddha's most radical premises. If every change you experience comes from fabrication, then you're fabricating your experience in ways you don't even realize. All that's experienced in dependence on the six senses, the five physical senses plus the mind as the sixth, counts as fabrication, intentional actions, and their results. This gives some idea of how subtle the goal will be, for it will have to lie totally outside of the six senses. It also indicates how important it is, in the course of the path, to become sensitive to the intentional actions that constitute fabrication. Otherwise, it's easy to fall into the pitfall of not detecting your intentions, and so to mistake something fabricated for something that's not. The Buddha mentions fabrication in many different contexts, but two main frameworks dominate his analyses. One in terms of the five aggregates of form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and consciousness, and the other in terms of bodily, verbal, and mental fabrication. Both frameworks deal first with the truths of suffering and its causes, but they also play a role in developing concentration, the heart of the path to the end of suffering. Here again, the Buddha shows his skill as a strategist. If you fabricate your experience under the influence of ignorance, your fabrications will have to lead to suffering. But if you fabricate with knowledge, they can form a path to suffering's end. And the best way to bring knowledge to the processes of fabrication is to shape them deliberately into a state of mind that is still enough and sensitive enough to allow you to detect even extremely refined and subtle fabrications. That's what the practice of concentration is for. From there, fabrications can be used to develop the insight that leads to dispassion even for concentration, and ultimately, even for the fabrications of insight itself. That's when the mind is truly freed. The five aggregates. The analysis into five aggregates comes primarily in the context of the First Noble Truth, where the Buddha's short analysis of suffering is the five clinging aggregates, the act of clinging to any of the five aggregates or any combination of the five. This context can be broken down into two main subcontexts: discussions of how the mind interprets and elaborates on sensory experience in general, and discussions of how the mind creates one of the primary elements of becoming, its sense of self-identity. The five aggregates can be defined as follows. Form. Any physical phenomenon, although the Buddha's focus here is less on the physical object in itself and more on the experience of the object. Feeling. Tones of pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure nor pain. Perception. The act of recognizing, mentally labeling, and identifying physical or mental phenomena. Fabrication. The intentional shaping of physical or mental phenomena. Consciousness. Awareness at the six senses. There's something of an anomaly here in that the term fabrication covers all five aggregates and yet is listed as one of the five. The following passage helps to explain why. Its terminology is a little strange, but one point is clear. The mental act of fabrication shapes the actual experience of all physical and mental phenomena in the aggregates for a purpose. And why do you call them fabrications? Because they fabricate fabricated things, thus they are called fabrications. What do they fabricate as a fabricated thing? For the sake of formness, they fabricate form as a fabricated thing. For the sake of feelingness, they fabricate feeling as a fabricated thing. For the sake of perceptionhood. For the sake of fabricationhood. For the sake of consciousnesshood, they fabricate consciousness as a fabricated thing. Because they fabricate fabricated things, they are called fabrications. SN 2279. This passage suggests that the act of fabrication is presented with potentials for any of the aggregates made available by past actions, and it acts for the sake of turning those potentials into the actual experience of those aggregates in the present. Fabrication, as a name for one of the aggregates, refers specifically to this mental process. As a term for all 5 aggregates, fabrication covers both the processes of fabrication and the fabricated aggregates, physical and mental, that result. The purposeful role of fabrication is also clear in another passage that defines it in relation to the 6 sense media. This passage occurs in the larger context of a discussion defining all 5 aggregates. And what are fabrications? These 6 classes of intention: intention with regard to forms, intention with regard to sounds, intention with regard to smells, intention with regard to tastes, intention with regard to tactile sensations, intention with regard to ideas. These are called fabrications. SN 2256. So, putting these 2 definitions together, we can say that fabrication, as the 4th aggregate, provides the intentional, purposeful element in all the aggregates. Here, it's important to note that aggregates are not just products of past activities. They themselves are also ongoing activities in the present moment. SN 2279 makes this point by defining the aggregates with verbs. Feelings are called feelings because they feel. Perceptions are called perceptions because they perceive, and so on. Even form deforms. In the course of acting in these ways, all 5 aggregates make use of other fabrications to create and condition still other fabrications, and they themselves then get used by other fabrications for a similar purpose, in an ongoing causal process. For instance, in the standard description of dependent co-arising, SN 12.2, fabrications and intentions, the 4th aggregate, arise prior to the experience of sensory contact. In another description of the same principle, they arise in dependence on sensory contact, MN 28. In this way, they both interpret and elaborate on sensory contacts already present to awareness, as well as playing a role in shaping the next experience of sensory contacts. A similar reciprocal relationship holds between aggregates and self-identity. On the one hand, self-identity can be built in any of 4 ways around any of the 5 aggregates, Visakkha. But lady, how does self-identification view come about? Sister Dhammadina, there is the case, friend Visakkha, where an uninstructed run-of-the-mill person who has no regard for noble ones is not well-versed or disciplined in their Dhamma, who has no regard for people of integrity, is not well-versed or disciplined in their Dhamma, assumes form to be the self, or the self as possessing form, or form as in the self, or the self as in form. He assumes feeling to be the self. He assumes perception to be the self. He assumes fabrications to be the self. He assumes consciousness to be the self, or the self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as in the self, or the self as in consciousness. This is how self-identification view comes about. MN 44. Then, Once any of these self-identity views are created around the aggregates, those views turn around and shape further aggregates. They do this by coloring the way in which sensory contact is received. From that reception, even more fabrications are brought into being. Thus, both this assumption and the understanding "I am" occur to him, an uninstructed, run-of-the-mill person. And so it is with reference to the understanding "I am" that there is the appearance of the 5 faculties: eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body, the senses of vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Now, there is the intellect. There are ideas. There is the property of ignorance. To an uninstructed run-of-the-mill person, touched by experience born of the contact of ignorance, there occur the thoughts: I am thus, I shall be, I shall not be, I shall be possessed of form, I shall be formless, I shall be percipient, conscious, I shall be non-percipient, or I shall be neither percipient nor non-percipient. SN 22:47. As this last passage shows, once there is a sense of self based on ignorance, it colors all sensory experience with questions about your current and future states of becoming. Thinking in these terms is how craving for becoming and non-becoming come about. The way out of this dilemma is first to learn how to master the processes of fabrication with knowledge. In this way, fabrications are brought out of the first noble truth into the fourth, as part of the path to the end of suffering. And here again, the analysis of fabrications under the framework of the aggregates plays a role. As AN 936 points out, once you have mastered any of the 4 jhanas, the stages of right concentration in the path to the end of suffering, you should learn to see that each jhana is composed of the 5 aggregates. For example, if the breath is your object of meditation, then the breath itself counts as form. The feelings of pleasure induced by being steadily alert to the breath count as feeling, the perceptions that anchor the mind on the breath count as perception, the intention to keep the breath in mind counts as fabrication, and awareness of all these processes counts as consciousness. By deliberately fashioning these fabrications into the non-sensual bliss of jhana, you're in a position not only to see how jhana is clearly a fabricated state, but also to pass judgment on your attachments to sensual pleasures. Non-sensual bliss is much more reliable and blameless than sensual pleasures can ever be. This ability to see the fact of fabrication along with the value of alternative fabrications prepares the mind for the activities of insight, a topic we will explore further below. But first we have to see how the Buddha's alternative framework for analyzing fabrications into bodily, verbal, and mental fabrications also functions both to explain suffering and to act as part of the path to its end. The 3 fabrications. This is a framework that the Buddha mentions briefly in the context of dependent co-arising, SN 12:2, where bodily, verbal, and mental fabrication are said to be conditioned by ignorance and in turn act as a condition for consciousness. What is meant by these 3 terms, though, is not defined in that context. There are, however, 2 other contexts where the Buddha does explain them in detail. The first context is a description of the ways in which 3 types of kama, bodily, verbal, and mental, play a role in shaping future lifetimes. In this description, these types of fabrication are analyzed in terms of the levels of skill with which they are fabricated and the corresponding levels of the cosmos to which they lead. And what is kama that is dark with dark result? There is the case where a certain person fabricates an injurious bodily fabrication, fabricates an injurious verbal fabrication, fabricates an injurious mental fabrication. Having fabricated an injurious bodily fabrication, having fabricated an injurious verbal fabrication, having fabricated an injurious mental fabrication, he re-arises in an injurious world. On re-arising in an injurious world, he is there touched by injurious contacts. Touched by injurious contacts, he experiences feelings that are exclusively painful, like those of the beings in hell. This is called kama, that is dark, with dark result. And what is kama, that is bright, with bright result? There is the case where a certain person fabricates a non-injurious bodily fabrication, a non-injurious verbal fabrication, a non-injurious mental fabrication. He re-arises in a non-injurious world. There he is touched by non-injurious contacts. He experiences feelings that are exclusively pleasant, like those of the beautiful black divas. This is called kama, that is bright with bright result. And what is kama, that is dark and bright, with dark and bright result? There is the case where a certain person fabricates a bodily fabrication that is injurious and non-injurious, a verbal fabrication that is injurious and non-injurious, a mental fabrication that is injurious and non-injurious. He re-arises in an injurious and non-injurious world. There he is touched by injurious and non-injurious contacts. He experiences injurious and non-injurious feelings, pleasure mingled with pain, like those of human beings, some devas, and some beings in the lower realms. This is called kama, that is dark and bright, with dark and bright result. AN 4-237. An alternative way of rating these sorts of fabrication classifies them as to whether they lead to pleasure, pain, or to the imperturbable levels of concentration, the fourth jhana, and the formless dimensions of the infinitude of space or of consciousness, which can lead to rebirth on imperturbable levels of becoming. If a person immersed in ignorance fabricates a meritorious fabrication, his/her consciousness goes on to merit. If he/she fabricates a demeritorious fabrication, his/her consciousness goes on to demerit. If he/she fabricates an imperturbable fabrication, his/her consciousness goes on to the imperturbable. SN 1251. Because future lives will entail birth, illness, and death, and in most cases, aging as well, these discussions of the three fabrications place them firmly under the first and second noble truths, suffering and its origination. The second context in which the Buddha gives detailed explanation for bodily, verbal, and mental fabrication is in describing the factors that go into the levels of right concentration, that is, part of the fourth noble truth, the path to the cessation of suffering. However, the definition of these three types of fabrication doesn't limit their application to the practice of concentration. Visakha. Now lady, what are fabrications? Sister Dhammadina. These three fabrications, friend Visakha, bodily fabrications, verbal fabrications, and mental fabrications. Visakha. But what are bodily fabrications? What are verbal fabrications? What are mental fabrications? Sister Dhammadina. In and out breaths are bodily fabrications. Directed thought and evaluation are verbal fabrications. Perceptions and feelings are mental fabrications. Visakha. But why are in and out breaths bodily fabrications? Why are directed thought and evaluation verbal fabrications? Why are perceptions and feelings mental fabrications? Sister Dhammadina. In and out breaths are bodily. These are things tied up with the body. That's why in and out breaths are bodily fabrications. Having first directed one's thoughts and made an evaluation, one then breaks out into speech. That's why directed thought and evaluation are verbal fabrications. Perceptions and feelings are mental. These are things tied up with the mind. That's why perceptions and feelings are mental fabrications. MN 44. These definitions of the three fabrications apply to the experience of the body in all activities, as well as to the shaping of verbal and mental activity in general. After all bodily action has to start with the breath. All verbal action has to start with directed thought and evaluation. All mental action has to start with perception and feeling. This means that these definitions of the three fabrications can be applied to all activity and mental states. For instance, they are especially useful for understanding how to dismantle the component factors of unskillful emotions and creating more skillful emotions in their place. As with the five aggregates, the best way to comprehend the fact and value of these three types of fabrications is to employ them in the practice of right concentration. Here they are analyzed not so much in terms of how they shape a single level of concentration, but in terms of how they separate out when moving from one level of concentration to the next, higher one. Much as metals in a sample of ore will separate out when their melting points are reached, as the ore is subjected to higher and higher temperatures. Visakkha. But when a monk is attaining the cessation of perception and feeling, which things cease first? Bodily fabrications, verbal fabrications, or mental fabrications? Sister Dhammadinna. When a monk is attaining the cessation of perception and feeling, friend Visakkha, verbal fabrications cease first, then bodily fabrications, then mental fabrications. MN 44. The following passage describes in more detail this progressive cessation of fabrications, and I have also taught the step-by-step cessation of fabrications. When one has attained the first jhana, speech has ceased. When one has attained the second jhana, directed thought and evaluation, verbal fabrications, have ceased. When one has attained the third jhana, rapture has ceased. When one has attained the fourth jhana, in and out breathing, bodily fabrication has ceased. When one has attained the dimension of the infinitude of space, the perception of forms has ceased. When one has attained the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness, the perception of the dimension of the infinitude of space has ceased. When one has attained the dimension of nothingness, the perception of the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness has ceased. When one has attained the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception, the perception of the dimension of nothingness has ceased. When one has attained the cessation of perception and feeling, mental fabrications have ceased. When a monk's effluence have ended, passion has ceased, aversion has ceased, delusion has ceased. SN 3611. It has been argued that these two contexts for understanding the three types of fabrication, karma and rebirth on the one hand, and the practice of concentration on the other, are totally unrelated, but it's hard to see what is gained by placing walls between them. Instead, it's much more useful to explore their relationships. That will allow the insights gained into fabrication in the present moment in the course of meditation to provide further understanding of how karma acts on larger scales of time. Here it bears repeating, all bodily action has to start with the breath. All verbal action has to start with directed thought and evaluation. All mental action has to start with perception and feeling. Gaining sensitivity to the fact and value of these fabrications in the present moment, which the practice of concentration allows for, is precisely what allows the meditator to develop dispassion for even the most skillful levels of fabrication that lead to further becoming. It's in this way that developing the fourth noble truth gives insight into the fabrications that normally would fall under the first truth and the second.